So, archaeology is inextricably tied to the dimensions of time and space, and often enough, this is acknowledged in publications in a section discussing their chronological and spatial extents. It is at this point that many archaeologists, even if they don't want to, will have to set the scale on the chronological and spatial limits of study based on some set of criteria. These criteria can be practical and objective. For example, the quantity and quality of data, the resolution of data capture or data display. And in this case, they are considered unsurpassable limitations, externally imposed and beyond negotiation. This is the easy way out of a problematic that otherwise can be quite challenging to a researcher. Determining the right scale for one study means identifying the scale of relevance to the phenomena studied. And if we want to give a small example, if one studies household use of space, one will choose to work on the microscale of the settlement or even of one household alone. But if one studies Mediterranean, Mycenaean maritime trade routes, then we would work on the macro scale of the Mediterranean, right? This is easier said than done. In practice, and especially when working with GIS, we need to set rigid boundaries in space and time that will define the extents of our maps, as well as the extent of our analysis. As a result, determining the limits of a study, even on the microscale of the settlement, can prove difficult because these limits have to be meaningful. If we use the example of the household again, would we limit our analysis to the interior of the house, or do we take into consideration the material in the streets around it, thinking that very often household garbage ended up in the streets and that many household activities and interactions actually took place outside the house? On a similar vein, the time scale can be determined based on a number of variables: the coverage of the excavated remains, the research interests and the expertise of the researchers, major events in the stratigraphy or the regional chronological periodization, and so on. So every stage of this decision-making process, well before one even starts to do any analytical work, demands a series of assumptions and interpretations that are made in the hopes that the scale chosen is sound, methodologically sound, and are meaningful to people in the past. In any case, we need to reflect upon this whole process and upon the very notion of spatial and temporal boundaries in the way we study past people's conceptualizations and experiences of space and time. Look at these maps. Having set the spatial extents a priori, anything that lies beyond these is depicted as blank space. Even if we keep in mind that people do not conceive space in brackets and anything beyond that as without meaning or value, as blank space, we must admit that the very use of this system imposes severe limitations on our understanding of the data, on our analysis, and on our interpretations. The development of landscape survey methods in the last 50 years and the analysis of human practices and interactions on the macro scale of large geographical regions and without any time period limitations has come as an efficient counter method to the fragmented and limiting understanding of time and space in the archaeological analysis of phenomena explored on the microscale of intra-settlement analysis. As a result, we can now observe two major analytical scales being widely employed in archaeological practice: the microscale of intra-settlement analysis and the macroscale of inter-settlement or regional analysis, with many archaeologists subconsciously tending to work at one analytical scale exclusively and implicitly without considering or feeling uncomfortable to explore other alternatives. These special scales are closely tied to different timescales as well. Intra-settlement analysis is tied to a micro time scale, understood and expressed in relative terms based on the stratigraphy of a site. However, and this is observed at sites with especially long sequences of human landscape interaction, temporal analysis of archaeological phenomena rarely covers the full chronological range available for very practical reasons that everybody knows here, and instead they are limited to segments of time. On the other hand, macroscale projects tend to work with wider chronological time period schemes, dividing time into intervals that vary from a few decades to centuries or even millennia long. Hence, the resolution of the time scale is limited, but this scale allows for researchers to trace the full temporal range of the archaeological phenomena in a wider region. One can't help noticing then that we lack studies that treat archaeological data on an intermediate spatio-temporal scale, a mesoscale if you want, and furthermore, we lack studies that explore archaeological phenomena on multiple spatio-temporal scales. Adopting a mesoscale would allow us to view archaeological sites within their immediate regional surroundings, to understand the dynamics of human landscape interactions within and beyond the confines of a settlement, to gain a more rounded understanding of how people engaged, experienced, exploited, or manipulated space, and to observe the evolution and possible transformation of this dynamic relationship throughout history. This is basically an approach on building biographies for each settlement. Geographical information systems are here to allow us to engage in such research as they facilitate an almost effortless integration and display of data over multiple spatial scales and over multiple periods of time. The dynamic display of data in GIS allows us then to operate in a scale continuum and to seamlessly jump from one scale to another, from local to global, and anything in between that. The case study I'm presenting today is focused on the settlement site of Thessaloniki Toumba in northern Greece. Thessaloniki Toumba is a tell settlement that formed over at least a millennium of continuous habitation on the same spot, covering the entire second millennium BC. During the second half of this period, that is the late Bronze Age, the number of settlements rapidly increased in central Macedonia, with tells being the only known form of habitation in the area. During the beginning of the early Iron Age, many tells were abandoned, with communities founding small settlements either on the plain or more frequently on raised earthen platforms with flat top, locally known as tables or trapezes. Tables could be raised around, next to, or at a distance from prehistoric tells. The table of Thessaloniki Toumba developed around the prehistoric tell, but contrary to other cases, its founding did not mean the abandonment of the prehistoric tell settlement, which continued to be occupied until the end of the 4th century BC. Along with the founding of settlements on tables, burial grounds were formed for the first time in central Macedonia, where late Bronze Age burials are conspicuously missing from the record. The end of the 4th century BC is marked by the founding of the city of Thessaloniki by Cassandros, which was populated, according to Strabo, by means of a synikismos from 26 settlements of the area. Among these were the community of Thessaloniki Toumba. To understand what influenced and changed people's experience and interaction with this landscape, we need to understand how people organize their everyday activities, their social encounters, and ultimately their social relations with reference to the landscape. The profound changes so briefly reported here must have been associated with deep changes in people's worldview and social structure, but it is unclear when these changes emerged and how intensive they were in order to lead communities to reconfigure their way of doing things and to adopt new strategies and practices. The task of building the biography of the community and the landscape of Thessaloniki Toumba was first undertaken in 2018 in collaboration with Melina Eftimiadou and Stegios Andreou, and the story presented here is corroborated also with results from the microscale analysis recently published in the Journal of Greek Archaeology. The data was compiled from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki's excavation archive, from published reports of the Effort of Antiquities, as well as from unpublished reports in the Historical Archive of the Greek Archaeological Service, from material produced and published by Léon Leray, dating the First World War period, maps from the Historical Archive of the Municipality of Thessaloniki, and from World War II aerial photos from the Library of the British School of Athens. Integration of this diverse data set created by others with different aims in mind and with methods and technical equipment of variable precision, resolution, depth of information, and coverage was challenging and had its toll on the range of research directions and questions that we could investigate. Still, the data compiled allow us to observe and present here some very interesting trends. There is not enough time here to present in detail the results of the microscale analysis of the prehistoric settlement on the Tell, and especially of one house, the remains of which cover a period of circa 200 years from 1200 to 1000 BC. But one important observation was that continued rebuilding of the settlement, so characteristic of tell-type sites, did not take place haphazardly at Thessaloniki Toumba compared to other sites of the same period, such as Kastanas Tel. Whenever the need arose, and that was not at the same time for all structures, as no large-scale destructive event has been documented today at the settlement, with the exception of an earthquake, a probable earthquake that affected differently its house, an effort was consciously made not to alter in any way the settlement layout or the shape and form of houses. This was effectuated by rebuilding the exterior walls of houses right on top of the stubs of their predecessors, and by using the same building techniques and materials throughout the settlement and through time. As a result, an impression of stability and uniformity was maintained, such that it was difficult for households to express their differences through the manipulation of the public aspects of their built environment. This principle, however, did not apply to the interior of houses. All houses were engaged in farming and stock raising, as well as hunting and fishing. The community had chosen a very good location between two streams with an immediate farming zone around it of more than 23 hectares, which according to isotopic analysis, they farmed intensively with the use of traction animals by penning animals close to the fields and using their manure as a fertilizer, and perhaps even by mobilizing people from neighboring settlements. Any differentiation among households was subtle and underlined in practices of storage and food and drink consumption, such as the use of Mycenaean-style pottery and the ability to organize and provide for feasting events, or in the operation of crafting activities, such as metal or purple dye production, with households succeeding in these fields of practice for variable periods of time. Towards the end of the late Bronze Age, in the late 12th and 11th century, the emergence of a small number of burials in the settlement, initially inside the house, close to the entrance, and later in open, semi-private and public areas, perhaps marks the introduction of a new ideology of ancestors, according to which select persons from some households received special care after their death. These individuals, a man and a woman, and 3 children, were interred at different times independently, according to a ritual which included also the placement of objects, especially small vessels used for the storage of high-value perfumed oils. The expansion of the settlement to its foothills and the formation of the table seems to have been gradual, starting from the area to the south of the Tel in the 10th century, according to a recent account by Kostadou Havela, and expanding towards the east and north of the Tel until the 7th century. Habitation followed the same principles as before, with narrow streets, irregular blocks of large rectangular houses, built with mud brick walls on stone foundations, large storerooms furnished with huge pithoi, cooking, food processing, and industrial facilities. The shift in habitation had its toll on the extent of farming lands immediately available to the settlement, as more than 1/3 of it was taken up by the new houses. During the same period, an early burial ground was organized to the south and at a distance of about 500 to 900 meters from the settlement, and perhaps the location was chosen so as not to take up any more fertile lands from their immediate vicinity. The scheme, however, did not last long, as very soon the burial ground expanded towards the north and closer to the settlement. In this cemetery, a general picture of homogeneity prevails, in terms of orientation, grave type and number, and variety of accompanying grave goods. Only one burial seems to stand out because it is accompanied by bronze collar and with 6 gilded bosses and iron and bronze rings, while 3 others display well-made and handmade vases together with few pieces of jewelry. In any case, the formal treatment of individual dead seems to indicate the rising importance of individual identities during this period. The 6th century is marked by a second expansion of settlement, this time beyond the limits of the table. The houses of this period follow the Greek style, according to excavator Kostas Suerev, with paved atria and multiple rooms around, corridors and stores, and at least in one case in Andron, a room where a number of symbolic vases were found. Interestingly, a limited number of burials take place in the open area almost next to the houses, and not in the area that was being used until then as a burial ground, while some burials are use monolithic sarcophagi instead of the traditional pit or cyst grave. Gold ornaments and mouthpieces, bronze jewelry, iron weaponry are among the grave gifts chosen to display the wealth that some families had acquired. Their location so close to the houses further could aim to the direct spatial and symbolic association of these burials to the households from which they came and differentiate them from other members of the community who were buried further away. During this time, habitation on the Tel never stopped, but remains have been largely obliterated by a major architectural reorganization and extensive leveling that took place on the Tel top in the 5th century BC. A new settlement plan was implemented then, and the new buildings erected were larger and built with large stone circles that could have supported even a second story. Interestingly, this period coincides with a lack of building remains from the surrounding area, even though burials continued to take place everywhere between the old settlement area and the earlier burial grounds. Not much is known about the area after the relocation of the community in Thessaloniki. Some sporadic habitation remains within the small number of burials dating to the 3rd century BC indicate that some part of the community remained there. This is the period when the wider area became transformed into the rural hinterland of the city of Thessaloniki. In fact, this is the picture we have of the area for all the rest of its history until the early 20th century. Maps, paintings, and air photos of this period show an empty landscape around the prehistoric settlement, which would have been some landmark as it stood in the field. But the area wasn't that empty. It lay close to the roads leading eastwards, as we can deduce by the presence nearby of the mid-3rd century BC Macedonian tomb of Mephtirio. During Roman times, a villa rustica was operating with many spaces, among which large storage spaces and crafting areas with a small kiln. In Byzantine times, a small cemetery operated on the Tel top, which could have been associated with the church, even though no such remains have yet been identified. The operation of the cemetery is interesting, considering that during the Middle Byzantine period, all burial grounds seem to be transferred in the interior of the city. The last stage known is the use of the area for the operation of a military camp for the Greek forces that participated in the Great War, and soon after that, for the installation of refugees from the Russian Caucasus in 1920 and Asia Minor in 1922. It is at that time that the past of the area resurfaces into the present as the people build their homes. It seems so that the area of Thessaloniki Tumba was used, transformed, and reconfigured into the minds and lives of people for 4 millennia, and the account presented here, although far from being complete or final, was aimed at discussing the history of a place as a continuum over multiple scales and over an extent that can neither be considered as local nor as regional. The approach is also based on the perspective of the community, forward-moving, and not on the retrospective vantage of the historian or the archaeologist. It is the story of a community that didn't know what the future held for it, that was making plans, evolving, adapting, and reconsidering itself and its practices as things were coming up and necessitated their action. Thank you very much for your attention.